Good evening, friends. Welcome to the YouTube channel GRE GMAT Titans. My name is Hitanshu Munjal and I'm your trainer. And in the last lecture, we have seen that how important it is to figure out the assumptions in an argument. Now, sometimes the job of figuring out the assumption seems very difficult. But thankfully, we have some common reasoning patterns that have standard assumptions, and that makes our job of figuring out assumptions quite easier. So today we are going to have a look at those common reasoning patterns. So the topic of the lecture today is common reasoning patterns making identifying assumption easier. But before that, we do some revision that how to identify gaps in an argument. Now we know that in order to figure out an assumption, we have to find gaps in an argument. So here in this practical example, we will understand how to find the gaps. So in many cases, gaps in reasoning are indicated by gaps in language. Look for words or phrases in the conclusion that do not come from the premises. Identify an assumption in the following example. Cream cheese contains half as many calories per tablespoon as does butter or margarine. Therefore, a bagel with cream cheese is more helpful than is a bagel with butter. So first find the conclusion. The word therefore gives the conclusion away. A bagel with cream cheese is more helpful than is a bagel with butter. Second, find the premise. So obviously we ask the question that what information does the author provide to support the conclusion? So obviously that information is that cream cheese contains half as many calories per tablespoon as does butter or margarine. So on the basis of this information, the author gives a conclusion that a bagel with cream cheese is more helpful than is a bagel with butter. So obviously the first line is the premise. The premise states that cream cheese contains half as many calories per tablespoon. So now how to look for the gap in the argument? So when we are transitioning from the premise towards the conclusion, so we try to find out that whether there has been a whether there has been a shift in the language. So how do we figure out the shift here? We see that what new word has been introduced in the conclusion. So here the new word that has been introduced is healthful, because this word has not been mentioned in the premise. So obviously, what is the assumption here? So assumption is that the food that have low calories are more healthful than foods having higher calories. So let's look at step 3. Third is look for shifts in language between the premise and conclusion. The premise compares the calorie content of a tablespoon of cream cheese to that of a tablespoon of butter or margarine. The conclusion introduces the word healthful, which does not appear in the premise. This shift in the argument language is indicative of a gap in reasoning. The argument leaps from a thing that has fewer calories per tablespoon to a thing that is more healthful. Therefore, this argument rests on the assumption that a food with fewer calories is a food that is more healthful. So let us have a look at common reasoning patterns. So the slide says not every argument models one of the common reasoning patterns, so you will sometimes still need to look for shifts in the language. However, when one of the common reasoning patterns is present, it can help you to locate information needed to strengthen or weaken an argument. Each of the 5 common patterns involves its own standard assumption or assumptions. Learning to recognize these patterns and the assumptions they incorporate will help you to identify unstated presuppositions and pinpoint an argument's flaws. So first common reasoning pattern is the causal pattern. So here it says, a study indicated that adults who listen to classical music regularly are less likely to have anxiety disorders. Clearly, classical music calms the nerves and reduces anxiety. So just on the basis of their observation, like maybe the situation is that a musician wanted to study the effects of classical music on people, so he arranges to perform a study and he invites a group of people over in a lab, and there he makes those people sit and listen to classical music, and afterwards he asks them that what are they feeling, how are they feeling after listening to the classical music. So those people report to him that they feel calm and they feel a reduction in anxiety. So now the question arises that is this conclusion correct just based on the observation? Okay. So has the author, before coming to this conclusion that classical music calms the nerves and reduces anxiety, has the author ruled out any other causes of reduction in anxiety? Because the possibility can be that the author has invited, some of those people might be on anxiety reducing medication. Okay, before coming to the study, they might have taken some kind of an anti-anxiety pill, or other people might not be of a disposition that they feel anxious easily enough, right? Like some people are of strong personalities and don't feel anxious easily enough. So if that was the case, that some people were already on anxiety reducing medication and some people were of a strong disposition and do not feel anxious easily in their daily lives. So in that case, can we conclusively say that classical music and only classical music calms the nerves and reduces anxiety? Okay, so here obviously what was the author's assumption? So authors, before reaching this conclusion, what was the author assuming? Since he did not rule out other causes of reduction in anxiety, what was the author assuming before reaching this conclusion? So obviously the author was assuming that there is no other cause of reduction in anxiety. Okay, and second thing, what if there was a different study conducted, and in that study they concluded that the classical music increases anxiety? Okay, so in that case, if the counter study indicates that classical music calms the nerves and if the counter study indicates that classical music increases anxiety, so therefore we can this could be a coincidence, right? This result, classical music calms the nerves and reduces anxiety, could also be a result of a coincidence, right? So again, before reaching this conclusion, the author assumed that this result is not a coincidence. So there are, in causal patterns, there are two standard assumptions: there is no other cause and it is not a coincidence. So let's understand this better by reading this example. So here it says, the author of this argument concludes that classical music calms the nerve and reduces anxiety. This conclusion is based on a study indicating that adults who listen to classical music regularly are less likely to have anxiety disorders. Thus, the premise posits a correlation between two things: exposure to classical music and reduced likelihood of anxiety disorders, and the conclusion makes a leap from correlation to causation. Our argument assumes that it is not a coincidence that adults who listen to classical music were less likely to have anxiety disorders, and that makes sense because it also assumes that nothing other than classical music caused study participants to experience fewer anxiety disorders. The first standard assumption suggests that classical music and only classical music, pay attention to the language please, it says classical music and only classical music caused participants in the study to experience fewer anxiety disorders. But what if something else was responsible? The passage doesn't rule out the possibility that the study participants used anxiety reducing medication, or that they simply happened to be calm people to begin with. In neither of these cases would it follow that classical music and only classical music calms the nerves and reduces anxiety. Thus, the argument must assume that a causal relationship exists. The second Standard assumption denies that the correlation between classical music and anxiety is a coincidence. But what if a different study indicated that adults who listen to classical music regularly were more likely to have anxiety disorders? In that case, it no longer follows that classical music calms the nerves and reduces anxiety. On the contrary, the counterexample suggests that the first study's results were coincidental. Thus, the argument must assume that the correlation between classical music and lower anxiety is not a coincidence. Now, let's move on to the next common reasoning pattern, planning patterns. So, this argument states, during the past 5 years, Meridian Township has seen a dramatic rise in crime. Sorry for that, I'll read it again. During the past 5 years, Meridian Township has seen a dramatic rise in crime. As a result, Meridian's police force plans to install video surveillance cameras at major intersections in neighborhoods that suffer the worst crime rates. Clearly, the crime rate in Meridian Township will drop. So, this is a situation here that in the Meridian Township, there has been a significant rise in crime, and people all there are frustrated because of it, and the press is also castigating the police officers that the police force is not functioning properly. They are helpless before the crimes. So the Meridian police force, they decide that they make a plan that they will install video surveillance cameras at major intersections in the neighborhoods that suffer the worst crime rates. And on the basis of this plan, they conclude that the crime rate in media townships will drop. So now the question we have to ask ourselves is that, is it true that just because of the installation of video surveillance cameras at major intersections in the neighborhoods that suffer the worst crime rates, the crime rate in Meridian Township will drop? Or the crime rate in Media Township will drop only because of the installation of the surveillance cameras? Is the installation of video surveillance cameras enough for stopping the crime or dropping the crime rate? These sort of questions we have to ask. Okay, so now the counter questioning is that, what if in these major intersections there is a power failure, or these areas are prone to frequent power failures? Then will these video surveillance cameras will be effective? Or second question is that what if the miscreants wear masks, the criminal wear masks and commit the crime? Then how will the video surveillance cameras help in reducing the crime? And what if these video surveillance cameras themselves are stolen? So obviously these kind of questions will arise. So basically the Meridian Township's police force have told the public about their plan, and because of their plan they are very confident that the crime rate in Meridian Township will drop. But when we counter question them, we pointed out various problems with the plan, right? So obviously the Meridian Township's police force assumption was that there is no problem with their plan, but as we have seen that there definitely are problems with their plan, and that's why this plan is not good. So in these planning patterns, the standard assumption will always be there is no problem with the plan. So let's read this. Consider this argument in terms of its parts. Meridian Township has a problem, a dramatic rise in crime. To address this problem, the police force plans to install video surveillance cameras. These are the premises of the argument because they outline the plan for addressing the problem. The argument concludes that as a result of instituting the plan, the crime rate will drop. In general, the conclusion of an argument that employs the planning pattern can simply be expressed. Do the plan. Every planning argument involves one standard assumption: there is no problem with the plan. Now, next common reasoning pattern is sampling pattern. So basically, in sampling pattern, a small sample is taken and the results of the study on that small sample are extrapolated to the general audience, or the general or a bigger sample, or a bigger number of people or things, right? Extrapolating means on the basis of study of a small sample, they give a conclusion about a bigger number of people or bigger number of items. So let's read this. Arguments that exhibit a sampling pattern are less common than causal or planning arguments. In a sampling argument, the author reaches a general conclusion about a population based on evidence about some members of the population. Sampling arguments assume that a smaller group is typical of a larger group and accurately reflects the relevant characteristics or feelings of the larger group. Here is an example. Contrary to popular belief, football fans overwhelmingly approve of the decisions made by the administrative staffs of their local teams. We know this to be true because a large group of fans leaving a stadium expressed admiration for their team's coaches and coordinators in an interview last week. So obviously we see the flaw here, that just on the basis of an interview of a small group of fans or a large group of fans, they gave the conclusion that about all the fans, all the football fans in that particular city or the country. So obviously, while giving this conclusion, the author's assumption was that this sample of large group of fans is representative of entire football fans in that particular city or country. So the standard assumption in sampling pattern is that the sample is representative. So let's read this further. The author of this argument concludes that football fans overwhelmingly approve of the decisions made by the administrative staffs of their local teams. This conclusion is based on the premise that a large group of fans leaving a stadium expressed admiration for their team's coaches and coordinators in an interview last week. Thus, the conclusion makes a leap from the opinion of one group of fans at a particular moment to the opinion of football fans in general. Every sampling argument involves one standard assumption: the sample is representative. Moving on to the next pattern, it's called the interpretation of evidence pattern. Basically, interpretation of evidence pattern is that on the basis of certain evidence, a conclusion is given, and the author assumes, while reaching the conclusion, the author assumes that the evidence on the basis of which he gives the conclusion cannot be interpreted in any other way. Okay, so let's read this. It says, one particularly common instance of this pattern involves the misinterpretation of statistical data. Not every argument that incorporates statistics is an interpretation of evidence argument, but arguments that exhibit this pattern frequently involve statistics. Most often the argument confuses percentages with actual values. Consider the following example. Local grocer: 90% of customers bought store brand soup last winter, but only 80% bought store brand soup this winter. Obviously, more customers bought store brand soup last winter. Okay. So just on the basis of percentages, I am talking about percentages, I am not talking about the actual values or numbers. So just upon the basis of percentages, the local grocer concludes that more customers bought store brand soup last winter. That means his sales have decreased. Now the counter questioning is that, okay sir, tell me, 90% of what number of customers? 80% of what number of customers? What were the total customers that visited your store last winter? And what were the total number of customers that visited your stores this winter? So if he answers that last winter there were 100 customers, that total number of customers that visited stores were 100. So 90% of 100 is 90. And this winter the numbers were 200, right? So 80% of 200 is 160. So obviously the total number of customers, obviously the customers that bought the store brand soup this winter are more, right? So here the local grocer's assumption was that this evidence of percentages cannot be interpreted in any other way. So let's read further. The author concludes that more customers bought store brand soup last winter. This conclusion is based on the premise that 90% of customers bought store soup last winter, but only 80% bought soup this winter. The premise describes a change in the percentage of customers who bought store brand soup, and the conclusion leaps from percentages to actual numbers. Every interpretation evidence argument involves one standard assumption. There is no other way to interpret the evidence. Moving further, analogy pattern. So analogy pattern is based on the assumption that there is a similarity between two things. So let's read this. These arguments characteristically assume that what is appropriate in one case is also appropriate in another. They typically rely on the assumption that two things are similar enough to sustain a comparison. Here is a simple example. Using this line of products has been shown to cause cancer in laboratory animals. Therefore, you should stop using this product. So obviously, they are comparing laboratory animals to human beings, and when they give the conclusion that you should stop using this line of products, their assumption is that laboratory animals are similar to human beings. So reading further, the author concludes that you should stop using this line of products. This conclusion is based on the premise that this line of products has been shown to cause cancer in laboratory animals. The premise concerns lab animals and the conclusion leads to humans. Thus, the argument relies on the assumption that humans and lab animals are similar. What causes cancer in laboratory animals also causes cancer in humans. Arguments by analogy involve one standard assumption. One thing is similar to another. So I hope guys, after studying this, studying about this common reasoning patterns, it is you won't find figuring out assumptions that much difficult while solving this critical reasoning questions. Thank you for joining, and you can mention your doubts in the comments. And please like, subscribe and share our channel. Thank you so much.